All right. Well, Johnny, really appreciate you being with us. Let me give you kind of a formal introduction and for myself and for this event. We are at the Faith and Sports Institute at Baylor's Truett Seminary. This is our Faith and Sports Forum event. My name is Paul. I am the assistant director of the Faith and Sports Institute. I'm a historian. That's my specialty, and what I focus on is the study of sports and Christianity. And with these events, we like to bring in thinkers, people who think deeply about sports and have conversations to help us understand sports better. And so Johnny Smith is one of my personal favorite sport historians. Just before we hit record, I was showing off my Johnny Smith collection. So here you go. A sport historian. Way back in grad school, I started reading him with his John Wooden book, and have followed him ever since. Does an excellent job of using sport as a lens into understanding culture and society, which is, I think, a really helpful way to understand why sports matter to us beyond the court, beyond the field. And Johnny's most recent book takes on the GOAT himself, Michael Jordan. Excellent read. We'll talk more about that later on. And then finally, a reason we wanted to have Johnny on is because in the spring, we are co-hosting an event with Baylor's history department, where Johnny will be coming to Baylor's campus and doing a talk as part of our Athletics, Race, and Christianity series, helping us look at Michael Jordan as this racial figure in American society and what his rise to success helps us see about how America approaches race. So that will be coming in April. This conversation is more informal, conversational, helping you get to know Johnny and learning more about sports. So Johnny, thank you so much for joining us. Should have mentioned too, you're a Georgia Tech professor of history. Anything else that we should add about you?
No, just I'm thrilled to talk to you. The folks at Baylor have been so good to me, you in particular. Thrilled that we have the April event on the calendar. Can't wait to come to Baylor and see the Dr. Pepper Museum with you. I'm looking forward to that. And it's just great. I'm appreciate everybody logging on here. We've got 23 people, so that's great. Really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us for this conversation.
Excellent. Well, let's get it started off the exact wrong way you would normally want to start off a conversation. I'm going to post a super long quote in the chat box for you to read through. And I do this because we want to talk for a second about history and why it matters so much that we need to approach this subject. And for those of you, some of you here hopping on this call, you're committed Christians. Some of you, maybe you're just sport historian and fans of sport history. One of the reasons at the Faith and Sports Institute that we want to take history seriously is because we believe as a first step towards living in the world, we need to understand the world around us. An excellent book that gets into this from more of a theological perspective is by Jamie Smith. It's called How to Inhabit Time. And the point that he makes is we live in a world that's shaped by forces we don't understand or recognize or appreciate. You can see there how he describes it. He says, we live among relics of time that live in laws, institutions, policies, and practices. We inherit these from generations that precede us. Smith goes on, he says, just like the rocks that surround us, these cultural and institutional givens compose an action environment that shapes how we live and move and act. The very givenness of these realities is a false invisibility. Because we don't see them, we are unaware of how we're shaped by such inheritances, how they constrain and channel the way we live. I'm biased because I'm a historian, but history is an excellent way at helping us break through that false invisibility, right? History helps us to make sense of the way things are. So we don't just take for granted our world, but we begin to say, well, why is it the way it is? And particularly for those of us who care about sports, we want to take a step and figure out, why is sports culture the way that it is? We have these heroes that we might look up to. We have these games that we play and love. But we want to take seriously how that might shape how we act, think, live, and behave. And sport history is a great way to break into those conversations. And so that's what we're going to be able to do today is break through some of the givenness of our sports institutions and culture and help to understand it a little bit better. So your career into sports history, Johnny, you are a sport historian, one of my favorites, as I mentioned it. But how do you even become that? What was your career arc? What was your journey to get into this?
Oh boy, gosh, Well, if I go back really far, I was a kid who grew up playing sports, loved to read about sports. I grew up in the Chicagoland area. That was one of the motivations for writing the book about Jordan. He was really a central part of my youth, and I could talk about that later. Um, Long story short, when I went to college, I was a history major at Michigan State University, and I took a course on the history of American sports. And I thought it was fascinating. I'd never really thought about the historical importance of sports in our culture. I grew up reading, biographies about Jackie Robinson and Hank Aaron and any athlete that I could read about, I did. But this was the first time that I recognized that academics, scholars study sports in a serious way. So it was really enlightening and eye-opening for me. And I also took a seminar in African American history, a research seminar, and we had to write a research paper on a topic of our choosing. And my professor, I asked him, look, I'd like to do something on sports. And somehow or another, I asked him if I could write about Muhammad Ali, if that was allowed. And he said, yeah, go with that. And so I think what was really interesting is how these classes really opened up my mind. And I remember as an undergraduate when I was at MSU, and I was doing this research, I loved going out into the stacks at the library and seeing all these old volumes of Sports Illustrated and Sport Magazine and opening up these dusty magazines and feeling like I had uncovered a world I didn't know existed. And I just fell in love with, going back in time. I had a very unsophisticated view of history and what it would mean to write history at that time. But the long and short of it is being a student of history is really what compelled me to think about historical scholarship around sport. The reality is, though, I think I probably would not have become a historian or historian who studies sports if I wasn't really interested in African American history. That is really what made me think seriously and critically about becoming a historian, and with the encouragement of my mentor at MSU, Pero Dagbovie, who studies Black history. So for me, sport was a way for me to better understand race in America, the history of race in America, the experiences of Black people in society, the experiences of Black athletes in America. So that was really the foundation. And then, Dr. Dagbovie told me I should think about going to grad school, which was, I couldn't even imagine what that looked like. My parents did not go to college, and I didn't really understand really what that would all entail going to grad school. But I really liked the idea of being a teacher and a writer. So I had this idea that, well, I'll just teach college students and become a professor and I'll write, But again, I really didn't know what I was getting myself into or what the process was going to be like. Well, I went on to get a master's degree at Western Michigan, and I wrote a master's thesis on the racial integration of Michigan State football. I was really interested in thinking more about my school, which was MSU. And what was interesting is that in the 1960s, Michigan State was the most progressive college football program in the country in terms of integrating on the field with their roster under Duffy Daugherty. And I love doing the research, like going into the archives, reading the old newspapers. I had the itch now. And then I went on to Purdue, where I earned my PhD in history under Randy Roberts. And Randy, I think, he's by far the person who has influenced my career and my life more than anyone outside of my parents. He really taught me what it means to be a writer, how to think about history, how to teach history. And so going to Purdue really changed the way that I saw myself and what I wanted to do. And I think it was at Purdue really where I began to discover what it was going to mean to be a historian who studies sports. And I started to have some success publishing a few journal articles as a graduate student. And then I really started looking ahead and thinking, okay, I want to be an author. I want to write books. And so I published my first dissertation about John Wooden and the UCLA dynasty that you mentioned before. That was my first book, came out in 2013. I spent a year as a postdoctoral fellow at Middle Tennessee State, teaching a 5.5, which was not a glamorous gig, and it made me question my future in this profession. I told myself I'll give it 5 years to land a tenure track job. Well, lucky me, Georgia Tech the following year, started this sports society and technology program in the College of Liberal Arts. It's an interdisciplinary program, and the college wanted to house this program in the School of History and Sociology. So they opened up a position to start the program looking for a postdoctoral fellow. I'd only been out of my PhD program for about a year. So I applied. I got the postdoc, came here to Georgia Tech, and somehow I convinced them to keep me around. And the rest is history. I ended up staying here. I think I'm in my like 11th or 12th year now at Georgia Tech, and it's been quite a journey.
Mm. Have 5 books you've authored or co-authored now, Netflix documentary based on one of your books. So pretty incredible how that's all worked out. Something you mentioned earlier that is interesting to me. The entry into sports history for you, you said, was because of your interest in African American history.
Yep.
And so for you, it was like sport was a lens to understand this other thing, right? A lot of times I found, with a sport history class, it's people who love sports and they're like, hey, let me take this class because I want to know everything I can about sports. And sometimes for those people, it actually is really challenging because when you take a sport history class, you're going to realize and study some aspects of sports you maybe didn't want to know about, right? You're going to have a more critical perspective. For you, how have you seen that tension between, right, this love of sports on the one hand, but then the method of academic disciplines means you're going to have to take a critical approach to understanding what it means?
Yeah, for sure. I remember a few years ago teaching a seminar on the history of American sports, and we talked about this debate among scholars between what's the difference between sport history and the history of sport. And it could be semantics, but I think there are some fundamental differences that you're suggesting here. I think you could identify sport history as a focus on what happens on the field or the track, inside the arena or the stadium, the games themselves, the contests themselves. And that's certainly part of studying sport history. But I think for me, as I try to describe it to my graduate students and undergrads, I see myself as a historian of sport, which means that what I'm really interested in is that relationship between sport and a particular context. Context meaning a specific time and place in America. So I'm interested in relationships, relationship between an athlete and his or her times, what's changing in society, what's changing in the culture, politics. Those relationships is really what interests a historian of sport. And I think a big part of it is that I was a history student. And then when I went on to graduate student, being a historian was really important to me. My training is in American history. There are other scholars who study sport or they see themselves as sport studies scholars who maybe they're trained in a different discipline like kinesiology or a sports studies program. And so they may approach their questions in a different way than I do. The other thing I try to emphasize with my students is that there's different layers to understanding the history of sports. On a very basic level, the history of sports is everything that happened in the past related to sport. On another level, it is the narratives around those sporting events, and how those narratives are created. I think a lot about how the media constructs narratives and stories about what happened, right? So when I'm reading newspaper accounts, magazine accounts, oral histories, or whatever, what I'm um, consuming are the narratives about the history of sports. And then on a third level, I think the history of sports is about interpretation, how we today as historians interpret the past, but also how the folks living at the time you're studying interpreted sports. So I try to teach students that there's these 3 different levels around the history of sport and really try to emphasize the importance of context, that context is crucial in trying to understand why a sporting event matters so much to people. At a different moment in time. I think that's crucial. And so you have to know something about American history or African American history to be able to, I think, write about the history of sports in a particular context. And for me, I grew up in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. Went to a really white high school. We didn't talk a lot about race when I was a kid growing up. It was not a conversation that took place in my household. But when I was, it's kind of a long story, but when I was a kid growing up, I knew the men's Northwestern basketball coaches. I was really good friends with one of the assistants' sons, and they weren't very good, but I got to be a ball boy. I got to be around the program a lot. And the head coach was a man named Ricky Birdsong, and he was a black man. And in the summer of 1999, a few years after he had been fired as coach of Northwestern, he was murdered in a hate crime in Illinois. And I was 18 at the time. And like I was devastated. This is the first time that I was forced to confront racism in a meaningful way beyond the black and white documentaries that I would see in my class. And so I went to the funeral, and it was like this predominantly black church. And I was by myself. And I remember hearing the stories about Coach Birdsong and just this awful tragedy that was affecting his kids. And I was sitting next to this African American woman who handed me a Kleenex because I was just like tears. And I didn't know what to do with these feelings. Um, so when I went to college, I was still wrestling with this. I didn't know who I could talk to about it, how to make sense of this tragedy, this violence. Um, and I turned to history. History is what helped me try to make sense of this. Um, and so really for me, that's where my interest in African American history began. I wanted to know more about the freedom struggle. I wanted to know more about resistance, the civil rights movement, but also that this powerful force of ugliness and hatred and violence, why it still existed in America. And so that tension that I was trying to process is what thrust me into these history courses. And really, so for me, once I started to learn more about history, I thought that sport would be a useful tool to bring students in, to bring readers in, just as it was for me. And so that's why much of my early work in particular, I wrote about African American athletes. That's where I wanted to sort of learn. And so one thing I try to stress to students of all levels is that if you want to do your own research, you want to do your own writing about a subject, choose something that speaks to you. That's what, I think where the fire comes from is that you find something that means something to you. And, that's where your own education begins.
Mm. History is autobiographical, right? How many historians is that the starting point? They have a question they want to pursue. They're curious about something that is meaningful to them, and it can lead to a lifelong journey of exploration. What it sounds like in your case, that certainly was how that happened. As you think about, we talked about first kind of a classroom of students interested in sports, how you would engage with them. What about maybe talking to people who are skeptical of the importance of sports? I'm sure you've run into some of these folks. I certainly have. Sometimes in the academy or outside of the academy, there can be a sense that it's not serious, right? Sport is something that maybe if you do, it's the book you write after you get tenure. Then you can do your sports project, but it's not like this serious intellectual project for some academics. If you were to make the case for what sports can tell us, how it helps us understand American society in particular, or the human experience, what are some of the unique ways that the study of sports really enlivens and enhances our understanding of the world we live in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, so when I was a PhD student working with Randy, and we were talking about a dissertation topic, and that I had a goal of becoming an academic historian, hopefully getting a tenure track job at a university, he said, you shouldn't do a dissertation that has to do with the history of sports. Now, mind you, this was coming from someone who had been one of the most productive historians of American sports. He said, don't do it, even though I came to Purdue to work with him to study this very subject. His reasoning, of course, was that he'd never seen a job opening in a history department for someone in the history of sports. It didn't happen. There was still a resistance, even though you would find in departments someone teaching a hobby course, a history of sports class, even though it wasn't their research area. Certainly, scholars in other departments on campuses were teaching sport history courses, like I said, kinesiology, or maybe an American Studies or some other program on campus. But he was worried, and rightfully so, that I would have a hard time getting a tenure track job if I wrote a dissertation about sports. And he was right in many ways. Like, if we're being realistic here, I got lucky in many ways. I positioned myself to take advantage of an opportunity, but I still got lucky. And I'm very mindful of that. So, I think, I get emails sometimes from potential graduate students who want to work with me, and they tell me they want to do what I do and they want to teach at a university and so on. And I remind them that in my career now, going back to being a graduate student and getting this job at Georgia Tech, I've only seen two job ads related to the history of sports. One is the one that I hold, and the other is one at the University of Wisconsin. It just doesn't happen. It's very difficult. So there's still that resistance, to your point about, whether or not we should take the history of sport seriously in history departments or other departments at universities. What I think I've tried to show here at Georgia Tech, when there's some skeptical folks about this program, is that sports has a lot to teach us about culture, social issues, politics, religion, capitalism, labor, uh, nationalism, ethnicity, immigration, on and on. All of those historical themes that are being taught in other classes, it's exactly what we're doing in our sport history courses. We're teaching about the history of America through sport. It is not trivia. Um, it's interesting. I'm going to be teaching a course next spring on the history of boxing. It's called Boxing, Race, and American Culture. And I often think of this quote that I heard Gerald Early make in a documentary. Gerald Early, for those who don't know, he's written about race in sports, baseball, boxing. Mostly those two sports are the ones that he's written about. But he made this statement that you could make the argument that the three most important black men in the 20th century were all boxers: Jack Johnson, Joe Louis, and Muhammad Ali. And of course, you can debate that point. But to the uninitiated, I would say, Professor Early has a really good argument here. Think about Jack Johnson in the early 20th century. This was a man who was, number one, the most famous black individual in America and the most hated black man in America. You can understand the culture of white supremacy by telling the story of how Jack Johnson becomes the first black man to hold a heavyweight title, but also this powerful backlash against him. The race riots that erupt when he beats the great white hope Jim Jeffries in 1910. And then fast forward to the 1930s and the Great Depression. If you want to understand what Joe Louis meant to Black America, you can read about the incredible stories taking place after his victories in Chicago and Harlem and Pittsburgh and these black neighborhoods, and read what he meant to them. And so I think that there's an opportunity here. We're talking about Jack Johnson or Joe Louis or Muhammad Ali, and you can make the argument that no one really defined the 60s in the ways that Muhammad Ali did, someone who shaped debates about race, religion, and the war. So all of these figures, they didn't just reflect society, I guess is my point. They shaped the times. And we can pick other athletes as well, men and women, people of different backgrounds who profoundly shaped the culture. And that's what I try to do in my writing. It's what I try to do in my classes. And I could give lots of examples, but I try to just make the case through examples and try to show too that these figures we're talking about, for example, Johnson, Joe Louis, Muhammad Ali, they're not just important historical sports figures. They're important American historical figures. And that's an important difference. And that's where I would begin the conversation, at least.
Mm. Well, let's dive into some of your latest work and think through kind of how you came up on the topic, and we'll open it up for some questions then. First, let's take a quick journey. All right, here's your. Let's see if I get these right in terms of the timing. So we start off. We've got John Wooden first. Is that correct? So
Yeah.
book number one, we're doing John.
Yeah.
It's in Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, right? It's like
Yeah.
not just Wooden. It's the basketball team that comes into play. Okay, so next we've got, oh boy,
Blood Brothers.
What Brothers? Okay, it was.
Yeah.
It was Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, who we were talking about here. Was it Mickey Mantle next?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. Then we have Mickey Mantle, and then we have a World War I book, not a biography, but Boston baseball, kind of within the heart of World War I, illuminating how sports intersects with a number of themes. And then finally, that takes us to Michael Jordan, your most recent book, just came out recently. How did you decide to write about Michael Jordan? I mean, this is, you probably couldn't find a figure more important culturally in terms of sports figures in our lifetimes. Um, and that's just daunting when I think about it, to write about someone who's been written about so much, who's also guarded in terms of sources. And you took this on and took on this project. What kind of inspired you to do that?
Maybe because I didn't know any better. I didn't know there was going to be this 10-hour ESPN documentary, The Last Dance, that would come out just shortly after I had signed the contract and was getting ready to write. And that was hard because now, during the pandemic, when there was no other live sporting events and sports fans were really hungry for content, The Last Dance became an event that drew millions of viewers. It fueled social media, sports talk radio. Journalists then went back in time and they covered the Jordan era. So it made my job harder, no question. I realized too that when I initially had a kind of an ambitious interview plan, that I was going to interview former teammates of Jordan's at the Bulls, and I was hoping that maybe I would get to talk to Phil Jackson, and that didn't happen either. What I realized was that a lot of those folks, they given tons of interviews already. They at some point got tired of giving interviews, and they didn't want to talk about Michael anymore, because I think for some teammates, they kind of resented the structure of the documentary because it was focused on him. And so this became the hardest book I've ever written in terms of just the intellectual challenges, not to mention, of course, that I was writing it during a pandemic. We were on lockdown. I had a baby at home. And, so these are the kinds of things that don't show up in the book necessarily. But if I go back to my original idea, why did I want to write this book before all of these events took place, before The Last Dance? I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, as I mentioned before, and Jordan was this incredible presence in my youth. I was part of that Jordan generation, the generation of kids who wanted to be like Mike. And so, given that I'd written about race in sports, mostly about topics, that were not nearly as recent, I began thinking about the fact that, historians really have not written about Jordan as a figure of the 80s and the early 90s. And I thought that there was room for me to employ my skills as a historian to think about how we can better understand race in America and the relationship between race and basketball through Jordan. And so, you raised this point about him, though, that is another hurdle. He's someone who doesn't give a lot of his inner thoughts and feelings. And I write about this in the preface of the book, and I try to explain where that comes from, why he was so guarded. I make the argument that on the one hand, he gets it from his dad, James, but also there were social, cultural, and historical reasons for why in the mid 1980s, this more conservative historical period, that Jordan made a conscious choice to withhold his thoughts about race in America and the consequences of those choices. So for me, it was really about trying to understand some fundamental questions. Number one is, how did race shape the way that Jordan saw himself as a public figure, as a Black athlete? But also, how did race shape the way that Americans of all different races view Jordan? What did he mean to them as a symbol? That was something that I wanted to unpack that journalists hadn't really addressed. And then finally, and I think this is something that I wrestled with throughout the writing, as I was asking this question of what happens when a person becomes a product? What happens when a Black athlete becomes the most popular spokesman, most recognizable American figure in the world? How does that happen? What are the consequences for Jordan? So I tried to answer those questions, and also to think about the major figures in Jordan's orbit, from his parents to his agent David Falk, to Jerry Krause and Phil Jackson and Jerry Reinsdorf, the owner of the Bulls, and his relationships with these figures. but also to think about Jordan on this historical continuum. Where does he fit among Black athletes? He's not like Ali. He's not like Jackie Robinson. He doesn't use his platform for disseminating an overtly political message. So in the first chapter, I really wanted to think about how he modeled himself after Julius Erving, which wasn't something that was explored in other biographies. But Julius Erving, in terms of the NBA, he was really the first national Black star who earned major endorsement deals. And Irving consciously buried his politics too. We think about Dr. J in the 70s when he's still playing the ABA. We think about how he really embodied this image of Black is beautiful, the big afro and the goatee. But he said explicitly, I had to cut the hair, trim the beard to get that corporate look. And Jordan reflected on the fact that, that image, Julius Erving's image of the man in the suit off the court, that's who he wanted to be. So at any rate, I tried to answer those questions, and we could talk more about those things, but those were some of my main motivations for writing the book.
You mentioned that becoming a product over a person, and this was for me, there's an element of tragedy, and I don't want to give away how you end the book. I'd encourage, folks to check it out. But as you're reading through it, you center it around this season, this triumphant season for Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. And yet it does end with a note of almost a sorrowful note, a poignant, sorrowful note. And I thought that's interesting because it counters a narrative that I myself, as a Michael Jordan fan, and even the Last Dance documentary kind of presents him as this champion, right? The unbeatable GOAT, who is the greatest of all time. And look what he accomplished by sheer force of will, right? That's kind of the image we get. It's all celebratory. And you do celebrate Jordan, but you also contextualize him, and you have nuance in how you approach his actions and what he did, sometimes in, I think, surprising ways that challenge different narratives that maybe scholars or journalists have had about Jordan. So I really, reading through this book, I could both see how it'd be really hard to write, and yet also how important it is to have a historian who has that broader perspective speak into and analyze and understand what Jordan was about. So I think you pulled that off well. And I certainly, I enjoyed reading through it. One section I told you I wanted to hit on, because we're here at a Seminary, Faith and Sports Institute.
Yeah.
You have this passage where you talk about Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls as like this religious space. And you're talking about what it would have meant to be in Chicago in the 80s. Jordan's on the rise. This team is successful. And it's almost like, Chicago becomes, the basketball court becomes a house of worship. And you have attenders who are celebrating Jordan as the icon, the hero. What's your sense of that religious like hold that sports, and Jordan in particular, can have on people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not a scholar of religion, but I noticed some patterns when I was reading primary sources and trying to wrestle with this very question you're raising here, because there's undoubtedly a relationship between religion and sport. But I was thinking, okay, how do you explain the deification of Jordan, right? That he's turned into an idol. Sometimes that term gets tossed around very loosely, but when I think about Jordan as an idol, I think of him as a very particular kind of idol, an idol of consumption, which basically means that he is both the salesman and the product. And so think about that Jumpman silhouette, the Nike logo, that's on all the Air Jordan sneakers. I try to explain how in the second half of the 80s and into the 90s, that emblem, that logo, that icon becomes part of a movement, really. And that movement is based on conspicuous consumption, where people define themselves in relation to their idol by buying products. You are what you wear. And so, I'm trying as a historian here to explain how the culture shaped this movement as much as the man. At the same time, I think what's interesting is that this is a time, like in the late 80s and early 90s, we see church attendance declining. and people looking for other outlets to feel part of something larger. So Chicago Stadium and the United Center where the Bulls played, where they become this house of worship, it is undoubtedly a place where people worship Michael Jordan as an idol. And so I'm not sure I'm smart enough to explain that relationship where people are maybe leaving the church, but they find this other kind of figure to worship. Maybe that's for you to explain. But I think it's worth contemplating where people are trying to find meaning outside of themselves. That's sort of the basic point that I'm trying to raise. And it's also interesting too, because a lot of times when I've been talking to like sports talk radio hosts, I notice that maybe they don't want to get into the racial aspects of the story so much. But one host told me that, what I love about sports is that it brings people together. It doesn't matter your race or your religion or your politics or whatever. We all come together and we cheer for the same team. And to me, what I know a lot of people believe that, but my sense is that is really what we might call like an imaginary community. It is temporary. It is fleeting. Because what happens, or what happened, I should say, if I'm grounding this in a historical conversation, you think about Chicago Stadium when Jordan is playing there through those first few championships. Chicago is the most segregated city, one of the most segregated cities in the country. There's an incredibly poor black neighborhood just across the street where white folks would not dare cross, or Michael Jordan did not engage those folks. And so my point simply is that there are certain boundaries that are not crossed outside of the stadium. And, I don't think that just because white folks were applauding Michael Jordan or they were huge fans of his, that they necessarily were thinking about what it meant to be black in America, how race shaped Jordan's life. And you see this in a lot of the primary sources, the sports writing, the Times, mostly white men who covered the NBA at that time. So I know I kind of drifted in some other areas here, but I think they're related. And those are some of the questions I was wrestling with and trying to better understand MJ.
Mm, that's really good. That gets right at what folks in the religious studies subculture who do write about sports. That's precisely what they're asking, right? Sources of meaning. How does sports create a space of belonging? But then, what does it accomplish? Does it just become a consumer ritual that doesn't lead to tangible changes in structures, or what happens when you actually leave the court? In some cases, can sport be a place where you can present an image of a change that hasn't actually been accomplished on the ground, right? You've consistently written about this with figures like a Muhammad Ali who called attention to this. And so to have Jordan fit in that framework too, I think is an interesting and important angle. I put in the chat box one of your quotes from the book because I think this gets at what you just talked about with consumerism and idolatry. You mentioned how Jordan became part of these relentless self-promotion campaigns that coalesce consumerism with idolatry. And so I know you're not using that language with a specifically faith-based or Christian kind of intent behind it, but for myself and for those who are Christians who come at this, that word idolatry comes with that's a big word that should matter. And it's one, in fact, that we would often use when we talk about Michael Jordan, this sense of turning a person into a figure that's godlike, and the danger that comes with that, and then the mechanism through which it happens. And for you, this is consumerism. This is Nike. This is the corporations that present an ideal image that for Michael Jordan takes a toll on him. I think you also do a good job of articulating what happens to the person when they're turned into an idol, that they can't live up to that. And so, yeah, I again encourage readers to check out those themes in the book. Okay, let's get to some Q&A, because I do want to give you all a chance to, if you've had some questions about Michael Jordan, about Johnny Smith, about sports history, feel free to share those, and we'll get to some of these. You can type them into the Q&A box or the chat box, whatever you'd prefer. I want to start with who might be a friend of yours. So David Zwart from Western Michigan University. So do you know David?
Yes, I do. I haven't seen him in a long time, but David and I went to graduate school together at Western Michigan, and he's now a historian, a professor, and I haven't seen him in a while, but one of the most down-to-earth, nicest people you'll ever meet. And I miss having lunches with David. So I hope he's
Well,
doing well. Thanks for joining us. What a great surprise.
yeah, I've met David as well, so I know David from a shared interest in Midwestern history. So it's cool that this was someone who was part of your journey growing up as well. Okay, we have another question, and this one this is something that I'll hear often from folks in our constituency, especially from predominantly white spaces. So here's it's that question of does activism in sports go too far? Does it turn off fan bases? Kind of like the Michael Jordan question about Republicans buy sneakers too, that you
Right.
write about. So here's a question. A person's son, 14 years old, grew up in Chicago, diverse area, in fact, was themselves playing in sports where they were the one white person on a team full of black players, looked up to a lot of black players, but was turned off by kind of the overt activism associated with the Black Lives Matter movement. And this is something that we'll see often, I think, from or you hear the rhetoric a lot of times. When you think about that, the impact in particular of activism related to the Black Lives Matter movement, just related to the rise of more aggressive and confident activism from black athletes. What kind of impact have you seen in the sports world from your perspective as a historian, maybe tracing it back even to the 1960s versus the present? Are we seeing some differences in this activism, and what are the effects of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, for the dad asking this question, the one thing I would try to help your son understand is to think about that. Well, I like to use stories. Try to teach through stories. And the thing that I might share with your son is I might use LeBron James as an example, right? Where does he come from? Comes from Akron, Ohio. Has this incredible story of success. He's celebrated, right? But, his home in Southern California is spray painting the N word. These bigots came to his house and they put the N word on his house. And so I would try to say to your son, think about what that says about our society, right? That there's this ugliness, this poison that still exists. That doesn't matter how successful you are as an athlete, as an NBA star, how much money you make, that Black folks still are not insulated from this kind of hatred. So then what I would suggest maybe is to ask your son to think about, okay, if you're LeBron James and you have this cultural influence, you have this platform, what do you do with it? What is your response to that attack on your family, right? Think about how scared you would be as a dad with 3 kids at home and a wife if you're LeBron James and you show up when you're out of town and that is on your garage defaced. And this is not the first time. I would say that this is part of our history. Go back to the 1960s when Bill Russell was the star of the Boston Celtics. And he came home with his wife and daughter and had seen that bigots had broken into his house, spray painted the N word on his bedroom wall, defecated in his bed, and smashed his trophies. And so I would pose this question. How would you like, was it acceptable for Bill Russell during the 1960s, during the civil rights movement, to speak out, to share this story? If it is, why is it not acceptable for LeBron James to use his platform today to share this story, to use his voice in the fight against racism, and to say that this is not acceptable? So I think it's important for us to remember, first and foremost, that when the games end, these young Black men and women who have embraced the Black Lives Matter movement, they're people who experience these tragedies as well. They experience the violence, and their family members and friends experience it. And so they are using what they have to push back against inequality and police brutality and the persistence of racism. And I think it's a good reminder that if LeBron James, of all people, experienced that kind of thing, we should step back and ask, well, why would that happen? And of course, that's not to say that white people need to feel guilty about these kinds of matters. Sometimes you get that, like, well, when we talk about racism, it's blown out of proportion, and these conversations make young white kids in school feel guilty about the past. I think it's important that we confront these issues. That's what I tried to do as a teenager. I wish that I had adults in my life when I was 18 who could help me think about these questions. So I'm glad that you're having these conversations with your son. I think that's crucial. And I think it's a reminder too, though, that sport plays an important role in getting us to think about how we respond to these circumstances. Why is it that, and I don't mean to misrepresent here, but that maybe he is not a fan of some of these athletes now? What is wrong with them speaking out? What is it that bothers him? Why does it make him uncomfortable? I think for a lot of folks, maybe teens and adults, they're under this false notion that politics has nothing to do with sports when sports are inherently political. They are inherently political, from who owns the teams, who broadcasts the games, to where the stadiums are built, the tax breaks that come with the construction of those stadiums, to the neighborhoods that exist around the stadiums, who lives there, who can afford to live there. I can go on and on. The Olympic Games are inherently political, right? I mean, so I think we have to really think about sports not just as fans, but as sites where people are trying to take ownership of those spaces in different ways, and how historically Black athletes have had to fight to make sure that they also had a space in the world of sports. So, that's a sort of a broad response to that question.
Hmm. Thanks, Johnny, and thank you for the question as well.
Yes.
One of the things I do appreciate about sports in particular is how it raises questions that are difficult to talk about. I think, especially in our social media age, there can be a sense of topics you can't discuss, or this person feels this way or that way, and they don't want to say it. And I think it's good for us to be able to bring story into it, to bring the people into it, and to focus on the humanity behind it, as you did, Johnny. And a couple other thoughts I had as you were sharing. One is, I often think about Jackie Robinson, and when we talk about activism and athletes, there can be this rhetoric of, oh, well, what do they have to complain about? What could they be protesting because they've achieved so much? They're so wealthy. Well, why wouldn't you be thankful for that? And Jackie Robinson writes about this. He's writing 50 years ago, right? His whole autobiography, I Never Had It Made, is precisely about this question. And Jackie Robinson says, yes, I'm thankful for these opportunities. Yes, there were ways that I'm grateful. But also, there's this work to do in communities. Just because a handful of athletes maybe have made it doesn't mean that everyone has made it. And for Jackie Robinson, yes, that meant African Americans. It meant anyone who experienced poverty. It meant anyone who experienced injustice. And so I think Jackie Robinson's vision of activism for athletes was one that could say, if you've made it as an individual, you still have responsibility to the communities that formed you to address and lean into those issues that matter to them. And to my mind, I see a recovery of some of that. And I'll add too, just from the faith-based angle, a lot of the athletes who advocate for this are Christians. I think of even most recently, CJ Stroud, the Houston Texans quarterback, who after one of his most recent games went and did an interview. He thanked Jesus, had this just remarkable, poignant expression of his faith, thanking Jesus for giving him a sense of identity, that it didn't matter how he performed, he had faith in Christ. And then in the same interview, talked about criminal justice reform and how his father was incarcerated and how there's a systemic problem with policing in the United States, and brought those two together. So I thought that was really interesting, how sometimes athletes, as they represent issues that matter to them, they're going to bring themselves into these spaces, and hopefully we'll have room for athletes to do that. I think certainly Christians appreciate it. Conservative Christians, when a Tim Tebow can share his faith, and so for athletes to share what matters to them, I think is a good thing. Another question for you, Johnny, getting on the topic of books and how these compare. Your Michael Jordan book is, on the one hand, a continuation of books you've done before, but you mentioned it was maybe the one more difficult ones that you've written. From your past books, besides the Michael Jordan one, do you have one that was like a favorite of yours, or maybe one that stands out in terms of maybe the writing process, or what was maybe the reception it received? Is there one of those that kind of stands out to you? If someone were to ask you, what book should I read? Which one are you giving to them first?
Yeah. You know, The Sons of Westwood, of course, being my first book is a proud accomplishment because when I set out on this journey, I thought, boy, if I could just write a book, I'd be really proud of that. That'd be something. And but now that I've written a few more, Blood Brother stands out. That's the book that most people would recognize. I'm not a best-selling author by any means. I like to think that I've accomplished something in my small lane over here. But Blood Brothers is a book that was really fun to write. It was my first collaboration with Randy Roberts, and we've written a total of 3 books together. We're now writing a fourth about Joe Lewis that I'm really excited about. And Blood Brothers was really fun because it required detective work. We had this story that we thought we could tell about how Cassius Clay became Muhammad Ali and the important role that Malcolm X played in his life. The hurdle for us, the real challenge was for this crucial period between 1962 and 1964, when Cassius Clay first meets Malcolm X, who at that time was seen as a demagogue, who was part of this quote unquote hate cult in the Nation of Islam. He was a toxic figure in many ways, and Cassius Clay couldn't be seen with him. So, as a historian trying to write this story, we knew that they met in secret in many, many ways because Cassius Clay did not want to jeopardize his shot at the heavyweight title. So that required us to really think through, well, how do you put them together? How do you become a fly on the wall when there's not a ton of source material? And so we used, FBI documents, which help us understand what was going on. The FBI had informants inside the Nation of Islam. You could, if you were reading the documents closely, figure out when they were together. There was also the New York Police Department had what was called BOSS or Bossy, the Bureau of Special Services. It's basically like the NYPD's FBI arm or intelligence gathering arm, using those sources, and also reading newspapers really carefully, knowing when Malcolm and young Cassius Clay were in the same city, and going through materials using digital newspaper archives that didn't exist in the past that allowed us to track down some unique sources. And also going into Muhammad Speaks, which was the Nation of Islam newspaper. We found a photograph from 1962. Cassius should not have allowed himself to be photographed. Randy and I were stunned at this because we thought, gosh, if a reporter from a mainstream newspaper saw this picture, they would have outed him in the summer of 1962, well before he's a #1 contender to take on Sonny Liston. So what was really fun about this book was putting all the pieces together, putting together this chronology, integrating the timeline of Malcolm's life and Cassius Clay's life, putting them together, and then thinking about, why this story was so important. And, for me, it's really rewarding because, um, readers have told me how much they enjoyed the book. It made some award lists or whatever. It became a documentary. We just published a young reader version of the book that's aimed at tweens and teens. And so I'm really excited about that. That book is doing well. So it's a unique story. And as an author, it's hard to find a great story with great source material. Sometimes I start a project and I think that, well, I'll have plenty of source material to carry it from the start to finish. And sometimes, when I'm writing, I realize, I really need more. I wish there was more, and I have to stretch what I have. That was not the case with Blood Brothers. But in some ways, with Jumpman, with the Mickey Mantle book, I ran into that challenge of source material. And I think also, having written now about Jordan, as much as I enjoyed it, I think I probably prefer to write about figures who are no longer living. And I think the reason for that is there's more unknowns to discover for me as an author. I think it was important for me to write the Jordan book because I had my own curiosities that I wanted to satisfy because I wanted to better understand Jordan as a historical figure, even in my own life in some ways, as you were talking about, writing being autobiographical. But I really like being in the archives. And so, right now in writing this book about Joe Lewis during World War II, there's all this great archival material, military records, papers in President Roosevelt's library, I could go on and on. It's making it a lot of fun, and it's allowing Randy and I to uncover some new stories that we're excited about. I won't say too much more because we're still writing it, but that's what I love. I love finding that kind of material. And with Jordan, it was all uh, public source material. It's not like the NBA or the Chicago Bulls were going to open up their archives to me. So, there's less mystery involved. And I think, for some readers who read the Jordan book, they might say that, I wish there were more new stories, but I'm telling you, there's not a lot of new stories that are being told. If those stories are being told in private, there's a reason they're not being told in public. So, at any rate, those are my thoughts about that.
Mm. Yeah, thanks for that. Well, there we go. New book that we have to look forward to. We got two sort of final rapid fire questions we'll get to
Okay,
here. I also want to shout out Randy Youngling. Thanks for this. He's mentioning how much he appreciates someone who is a fan of Bill Russell, grew up in the 60s, also got to play against Coach Wooden, apparently. So Randy got to compete against him, planning on reading your next books. Randy, it's good to have you here. Thank you.
cool. Thank you,
Uh,
Randy.
David's got a good question for us as well. And
Okay.
then maybe we'll end with the final question after this one. He wants to know about the connection between Jordan and Barack Obama's rise in Chicago. This was interesting, how you situate Jordan with the context of these other Black leaders and their rise to influence. I thought that was a pretty fascinating angle too. How important was Jordan to the rise of Barack Obama? David asks.
Yeah, great question, David. I was wrestling with this in the epilogue and even earlier, actually, now that I think about it, because early in the book, when I talk about Jordan being in Chicago, I read about the fact that the three most famous Black Americans from, say, well, from the 90s to the present, really, um, Barack Obama, Oprah Winfrey, Michael Jordan, they all come through Chicago at crucial turning points in their careers and in their lives. And I think maybe the point that I would make about this relationship between um, Barack Obama becoming the first Black president and Michael Jordan is that this whole idea of a post-racial America didn't begin with the election of Barack Obama. You really see it in the age of Michael Jordan, that he is celebrated as this figure who transcends race in ways that hadn't been described of a Black hero, if you will, before. And you see this in popular culture in a lot of ways in the late 80s with other prominent Black celebrities like Bill Cosby and Whitney Houston and Eddie Murphy, and you could name some others, Magic Johnson. And so I think the link is that for many white Americans, they began to see that in the NBA, these rosters that were 75 to 80% black, they were a byproduct of all the victories of the civil rights movement. And Jordan and the NBA became sort of a measurement of America's racial progress. Now, of course, what do we see with the backlash when Barack Obama becomes president? That even though comes to be seen as this candidate builds this Democratic coalition, big D and small d, a powerful moment for America. But there's this retrenchment that you see with the rise of the Tea Party and this resistance to the idea of a Black man in the authority position in America. And so, I think it's fascinating to think about this mythology around the idea of a post-racial America, which never existed. But that conversation begins, I think, in the Jordan era, and it climaxes in many ways with Barack Obama. But of course, I don't think we're really hearing about that mythology now because America has come to confront the reality in many ways with the Black Lives Matter movement that the mythology has been exposed and Black athletes are confronting it in important ways. I think, Jordan himself in some ways echoed the mythology around post-racial America, saying things like, I don't think white Americans see me as a Black person. They see me as a person, as if race should be just erased from the conversation, that his skin color didn't matter, when in fact it did. And the other thing too, though, that's interesting about Barack Obama, and I quote him in the book, is that he says that Jordan brought all of Chicago together. That was the role that Jordan played, that he was this racial unifier. And I think that's important. And I respect Obama's position on this, and other sports fans who said that that was the role Jordan played, that was a meaningful role. And again, it goes back to trying to understand how people interpreted Jordan, his significance. I wanted to understand that better. And so that's what I hope to contribute in the book, is to get people to think about the ways that Jordan was understood by the public, from Barack Obama to fans that we've never heard of who were just going to Chicago Stadium because they love Michael Jordan.
All right, we'll close with this one. Is Michael Jordan the GOAT?
Oh, Paul. I get asked this question, and you're not going to like my answer, because my
I know
answer
I'm not. I know I'm not.
is so academic. I think it's as a historian, I think it's unproductive to compare athletes across eras. Like, I think it's kind of silly, frankly. But I will say this to give you some kind of substance answer. I don't see LeBron James as inheriting Jordan's crown. There's not a direct line from Jordan to LeBron. They're very different in the way that they grew up, in their ambitions, how they present themselves culturally and politically. So I think it's important to understand that history is not linear. I'm often asked, well, okay, like in the 60s, Muhammad Ali and Kareem and Bill Russell, black athletes were outspoken and engaged. And then in the Jordan era, not so much. And then what happens, around 2015, 2016, we see this emergence of activism taking place. And this is, again, why I try to remind my students that context matters. In the Jordan era of the late 80s and 90s, there was not this unified black political movement. And it's certainly not one that Jordan identified with, that would inspire him to see himself as connected to some movement where he felt like he had to use his platform in a way that pushed back against inequality in some profound way. So I think that's why it's important to think about these athletes in a context. But I will say this, in the 90s, undoubtedly he was the best, right? And one of the things I thought was really interesting that Magic Johnson had said as early as 1987, before Jordan had won a title, is he said that Michael's the best player in the NBA. Everybody wanted to look to Larry Bird and to Magic Johnson. This is what Magic is saying. He said, but Michael's the best, even without a ring. He's the best player. And of course, he would go on to win 6 to Magic's 5. But they were contemporaries. It's a little easier to compare Michael and Magic in some ways, even though they were very different players who won in very different ways. But the reality is LeBron can do things that Michael could not do, right? Like, LeBron can guard players that Michael could not guard, as great of a defender as Michael was. And there's things that Michael can do that LeBron couldn't do. But Michael was the best player that I've ever seen. I'll put it that way.
There you go. Like it. No, I enjoy the conversation, even though it's, in a sense, it's silly. But why I like it is because, to me, it's the question of, why do you think that? Why is it so important to claim that there is a GOAT or whatever? And what does it say about you, right? How do we determine that at all?
I have something to say about that.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that the question really has to do with masculinity and
Okay.
generations. That, we want to claim our generation as being the best because it says something about us, particularly as men, right? That Jordan represents us and our generation, when the NBA was supposedly tougher and they played defense better and it was just more grueling. And that says something about our manhood. And then a younger generation wants to say, well, wait a minute, like, my generation, LeBron's generation, Steph Curry, we're better athletes, we're better all-around players, and that says something about us. I think it has a lot to do with that relationship between generations and masculinity, because we're really asking, like, what is the better era of NBA players in their prime? Is it my era, someone who's like in their 40s now? Or is it this era of fans who are like in their 20s and they identify with LeBron? So I think that's part of it.
Interesting. I like that. We've got in the comments a couple amens to that as well.
Okay. Thank you,
And
Randy.
the angle, I haven't taken it in quite that angle before, but I've often said, when we talk about the GOAT, I think you just have a starting point of who was considered the greatest for a whole era, right?
Yeah.
If there's anyone who's undisputably the greatest for a whole era, they can be in the conversation. So do you want to say it's Bill Russell? Do you want to say it's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar? Do you want to say it's Michael Jordan? Do you want to say it's LeBron? Like those four were kind of undisputed in terms of for a sustained period of time, they were considered the best. And
Right.
then, since Magic and Larry were kind of, it wasn't exactly clear who it was, then they're kind of in that next tier because they weren't the quote unquote undisputed. So that's how I approach it. But I think you're absolutely right. It's goes back to the beginning with your Michael Jordan book. It's who does this person represent, right? How do they carry the meanings of the fans and represent a vision of what it means to be a man, to be an American, all of those forms of identity. And that does become then central to the fans' identity. So to claim this person is the greatest is to claim something about yourself. I like that insight. I think that's a super helpful way to think about it. All right, as we close, thanks so much for the conversation. Just a couple final thoughts here. Someone's challenging Johnny to write a book on the rise of football in the U.S. And we also had another amen on MJ being the GOAT. I appreciate that. I'll go with Michael Jordan as the GOAT as well. I want to close too to bring us back to the author I cited at the beginning, which was Jamie Smith. And he's talking again about history. And he says this, he says, history is contingent. You heard Johnny mention this contingency, complexity, the context of history. He says contingency means that of every history, we can say it didn't have to be this way, and this is the way it is. The question at the intersection is now what, how to live forward. So for those of us who are trained as historians, we aren't trained to answer the now what do we do question, right? We're trained to study the past to make sense of it. And that's what we present. Here is Michael Jordan. Here is Muhammad Ali. Here is John Wooden. Here's what they can tell us about the past. And then it's up to us as people. And if we're Christians, it's up to us as Christians to say, okay, given what we know about the past and how it shapes the present, how then do we live? And I think that's a role for all of us. For those of you on the call who are Christians and who are thinking about how your faith might shape how you approach these topics, the so what question is the one that you have to move to next. And hopefully doing that in community with others as we figure out how to make sense of the past. So thanks so much. Appreciate all your contributions. And Johnny, especially so thankful for you and for hopping on, having this talk. Really looking forward to April 18th at Baylor University as well. Thanks again for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. This was great. Thanks to everyone for attending and your great questions in the chat box. This was a lot of fun. Sometimes these Zoom sessions, you don't know what you're going to get, but this was a great group and I really enjoyed doing it today. So this was the best part of my day.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Johnny. We'll see y'all. Have a great Monday.
Okay, take care, everyone.